Well, listen, I do want to go over briefly, Jeff, just the poll questions to get those out of the way. The first one, in terms of what is the first capital of New York State, that was a trick question. It is Kingston, but Esopus, the last entry, is actually the Indian Native American name for Kingston. So either answer would have been appropriate.
Okay.
Kingston was the first capital of New York State, and when it was founded as a state, and New York was admitted as the number 11 state in the Union, I believe in 1778. And so that was that answer. There were also 12 original counties when the English came in 1664, but again, the number 10 could have sufficed as an answer, and here's why. Out of those 12, 10 were only in New York State. There were 2 counties, I believe Duke, and I'm trying to think of the other one, Cornwall, that were actually outside of current-day New York, because the New York territory was much bigger than it was now. And then the last one, yes, it is a state law since, I believe, 1919, that every governmental division in New York State must have an appointed historian, and they are a great resource for information. I'm going to show you, I believe I have a link that shows all of their contact information, at least on the county level. So great, and thanks for the intro, Jeff, and I'm going to get started if that's okay.
Okay, the time's all yours.
Perfect. Well, listen, I want to thank everyone. This is what we're going to cover today in our overview. We're going to start off with a Knickerbocker's approach to New York genealogy. I don't know how many of you know what a Knickerbocker is. It's a term from Washington Irving, the author, and a Knickerbocker is someone who with a long New York State heritage, and that is the term. And so we're gonna take a certain approach to New York genealogy. I want to make it clear that this approach will work on almost any state. You know, New York is not different than any other state research, really, when it comes down to it. It is different in terms of the record set, but if you have a basic methodology, you'll be successful. We do need to go over a brief New York history lesson, discuss New York migration patterns. We're going to spend much of our time on 10 resources you really should know for New York ancestor research, and then I'm going to reveal some of my secret links, Knickerbocker's secret links. So let's get started. So we're here for tracing your New York ancestors, and let's first talk about methodology and approach to New York genealogy. Now, as I said before, I grew up in the Empire State. My ancestors arrived as early as the 1630s. This is about 20 years after Henry Hudson plied his boat, the Half Moon, up the Hudson River. So I've been able to identify a lot of resources from New York researchers, but I've also developed a certain research methodology that I feel gets results. So, first thing is you must understand your history. You have to have a basic understanding of New York history, even the simple timeline dates. And the reason for this is you will have an easier time of placing your ancestors in the historical context. Then once you know how your ancestors fit in, that will allow you to find more data and to analyze the data that you do find. Here's a map. This is the Erie Canal. Very important in the New York history, very important in the migration patterns, very important in terms of commerce, and also bringing any ancestor from New England across into the Great Lakes area. So here's an example of it. Second point is to build a research toolbox. Now, there's nothing more frustrating than having to remember those links to websites, where you stored those digital files, books and emails, things like that. You should take time to get organized. This way you're spending less time searching for resources, and you have more time for searching your New York ancestors. Motivation matters. You should understand why your ancestors came to New York. Was it land speculation right after the Revolutionary War? Did they work on the Erie Canal? Did they follow some of the commerce along the way of the Erie Canal? Really, it helps to know what motivated them to leave their homeland, to come to New York, and maybe even leave New York. Here's an example. This is one of the historical markers in New Paltz. New Paltz, you can see, was founded. It is in Ulster County, in the southern area, Hudson Valley area of New York, and it was founded by the Huguenots. The Huguenots were refugees from France. Their motivation was religious persecution. I actually have Huguenot ancestry. One of these 6 houses belongs or was built by my 9th great-grandfather, Hugo Freer. Leave no stone unturned. Before you declare that you have blocked research or you have the proverbial brick wall, have you really done a reasonably exhaustive search of all the resources at your disposal? This is very important in terms of your methodology. Something that I think many people will jump to say, oh, I have a brick wall. And you need to make sure that you have turned over every stone. Realize that not everything is online. This poster is courtesy of the California Genealogical Society in Oakland, California. I think it does a great job in representing the fact that I believe 90% of records are not online. They're not digitized. The internet really is just the tip of the iceberg. Make sure you're getting out into those archives and into those libraries to do your research. Use a research log. I will admit I have made some missteps in my genealogy journey. One of them was really not using a research log until probably the past 7 years. This is an example of one that I have created in Excel. And what I do is I track when I found a record, what the record name is, the repository, the record type. I put my source citation in there. The nice thing is when you use a research log, you can find a similar source citation, copy and paste it, and just make changes to it. Then I have transcript, extract. I also note down things like evidence and other information as well. So if you're not using a research log, you really will find that you're doing double work. You need to be able to analyze that data, and if you're not using the research log, you may actually be repeating your research, and it will take you longer to find those breakthroughs. Work your network. Here's an old-fashioned barn raising. Talk about a network in a small town. Actually, this may very well be, I don't know if it's New York or not, but make sure that you are utilizing your full network. Use those mailing lists. Use those message forums. Attend Genealogy Society meetings. Go to conferences. Connect with other researchers. Follow New York genealogy blogs, New York websites, and leave comments about your research. You never know when someone's going to see that comment and respond back to you and say, hey, I have the same family line, or I have a John Williams in my family, etc. And then finally, my last point is cite your sources. Get in the habit of writing even the most basic of citations. This is going to help track your work, and you'll spend less time re-researching and circling back. So now we're ready for a brief New York history lesson, and let's get started. First thing is New Netherlands. Well, before that actually, New York history starts when Henry Hudson as well as Samuel du Champlain arrived about 1609. Now by 1624 the Dutch had established a settlement of New Netherlands, and this lasted until 1664, and that is when the English drove the Dutch out and renamed the colony as New York. Now in 1663, I shouldn't have advanced that, but we're not there yet, but also everyone thinks that was the date, 1664, boom, it was over. Not true. In 1673, there was actually an Anglo-Dutch war where the Dutch recaptured part of New Amsterdam, which is New York City, and then it was finally surrendered to the English in 1674. So the English did not have full control of New York until 1674. Now moving on to the Revolutionary War period, New York declared its own independence from Great Britain July 9th. This is 5 days after July 4th, July 9th, 1776, and they adopted their first constitution April 20th, 1777. Also, realize that many loyalists were located in New York, and one of the most important battles of the Revolution took place at Saratoga in 1777. That's what we're seeing here on this stamp from the 1930s. 1788, New York, as I said earlier, became the 11th state. And did you know New York City was the first capital of the United States in 1789? That's why that was a bit of a trick question. New York was never the state capital. New York was the capital for the United States. Important part of New York history is epidemics and pandemics and illnesses. They were rampant throughout New York history. There were yellow fever epidemics in 1702, 1795, 1805, 1819, and 1822. There was actually the Great Epidemic of 1798, killed over 2,000 people. Cholera also changed the history of New York. Pandemics occurred in 1832, 1848, 1854. An important event that came out of the cholera epidemics was the rural cemetery movement. This is where cities built cemeteries outside the city walls, and this is very important. Innovation. New York was and continues to be a place of innovation. Here's some information. 1807, the first steamboat, known as Fulton's Folly, traveled from New York to Albany. Erie Canal, completed in 1825, and this was responsible for a massive westward migration across the state. 1831 is when the first railroad opened in New York State, and in 1848, the first women's rights conference was held in Seneca Falls. Wars. Men and women of New York provided troops, supplies, and support during the War of 1812, a lot of battles up around the Niagara area, and also the Civil War. New York provided almost 1/6 of the Union forces for the Civil War. In the late 19th century, there were many achievements. The Brooklyn Bridge opened in 1883. The Statue of Liberty was opened in 1886 as a gift from France. 1892, this is a photo from Ellis Island. They opened, and this began in 1892. West Castle Garden was the immigration point, the arrival point prior to that. And the major wave of immigration that would bring 12 million people through the doors of Ellis Island began. And then disasters. They also visited New York. Did you know in 1835 there was a fire in New York City, destroyed over 600 buildings? The Great Blizzard of 1888 paralyzed much of the East Coast. This photo here shows you the General Slocum. That was a passenger ship that killed over 1,000 passengers, many from Little Germany in Manhattan. Major blackouts. Now, 1965, but I remember the one in 1977. And then, of course, the attack on the World Trade Center in 2001. And those are some of the 20th century. Also the World's Fair here. World's Fair was held in 1939 as well as 1964. The Olympics in Lake Placid, 1932 and 1984. So there is quite a bit of history. That's what I loved about growing up in New York, is there was always history all around, and my mother made sure to take us as kids to a lot of the sites. Let's talk briefly about New York migration patterns, then we'll get into some fun links here. You have to understand the motivations as to why people left their homeland, or even why they left New England and migrated westward. First is religion. Religious persecution, as well as seeking moderation. One of the first groups to arrive were the Huguenots. They were Protestants from France, and they arrived starting in the 1670s, and they left France due to persecution. Also, keep in mind that New Englanders from the Puritan colonies, they wanted a more moderate religious atmosphere. They didn't want the restrictions in some of the colonies in New England, and that is why they came to New York. In the late 19th and 20th century, many of the Europeans, especially Eastern Europeans and Jews, left because of religious persecution. That is one of the main push factors for coming to New York. Commerce. I love this photo. This is from Lowville, New York, where my great-grandfather was born. That is a dairy area. Kraft cheese is still located there and makes most of the Kraft cheese, cream cheese, on the East Coast. The first commerce was probably one of the first big motivators. The Dutch arrived basically to establish commerce and trading posts, as did the French. The French were more involved in the fur trade up and down the Hudson.